We've had lots of fanfare. Ottawa said it has removed all interprovincial trade barriers under its jurisdiction. And provinces are announcing their own steps. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Alberta's Danielle Smith, saying today they plan to increase trade between their provinces. But our guest says, in reality, the costs of these interprovincial trade barriers are minimal. Removing them does little to help protect us against US import duties. And this could end up hurting Canadian workers, consumers, and the environment. We're joined by Marc Lee, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Marc, thanks for joining us. I know CIBC has said something similar, the Economist there, that this is not a panacea and that a lot of the barriers have been taken away over the years already.
Yeah, I mean, Statistics Canada did a study that they released earlier this year where they surveyed Canadian businesses and looking at their engagement in interprovincial trade. A lot of them are either buying or selling from other provinces. And when asked about the barriers that they're facing, no one said that there are trade barriers, crossing into other jurisdictions. It's really a matter of distance and transportation cost. So, where I live in Vancouver, it's about 4,500 kilometers to get to Toronto or Montreal. And there are certain costs associated with doing that. We also have a long tradition in Canada. Part of the reason why we are a country is that we allow free trade in goods and services across the country. That's embedded in our Constitution. And then it's been updated in recent decades. When we first started signing international trade agreements, there was an onus on making sure that our interprovincial trade lined up with those agreements. So we had a 1995 agreement on internal trade, which was a response to the NAFTA agreement with Canada, US, and Mexico. And then in 2017, we brought in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which again reiterates free trade in goods, services, and investment across the country. This to be consistent with the Canada-Europe trade agreement. But basically, there are a few exceptions to that, and that's kind of what the focus has been on. Now, certain areas are really not on the table at all. Things like supply management. Alcohol trade is one where there are legit barriers between the provinces, largely due to these provincial liquor distribution monopolies. But it doesn't appear to be a whole lot of movement on that issue as well. We also allow things like healthcare and education to be carved out of the agreement. Anything to do with Indigenous people and treaty rights similarly. So really what's left is some difference is in regulation in terms of things like environmental protection, consumer protection, health and safety for workers. It's not obvious that these are actual barriers that are affecting Canadian businesses and that removing them would unleash, hundreds of billions of dollars in new economic activity in Canada.
It's interesting. I mean, you say Ontario has relatively good rules on pesticide or strong rules on pesticide use in agriculture, or BC, you approve of their moves, a rethink on the concerns about open fish farms, and you think that valuable measures like that could be eroded?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly because, governments are moving, first of all, to try to centralize power over decision making. So we saw this with the recent federal bills related to new infrastructure projects. We see this in the Ontario legislation and the BC legislation. It essentially gives the Premier and Cabinet more decision-making power to sort of arbitrarily overrule the existing processes that have been set up, in terms of like public consultation or any other things like that. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's also a push to remove what are called the exceptions to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. And some of these are a little puzzling because in the context of the federal government, you might wonder, how is the federal government impeding interprovincial trade? I mean, generally speaking, it's not. There's really just a handful of things in terms of federal government procurement, for example. So if you're looking at CSIS, the Canadian Spy Agency, they would have more leeway to award a contract to Quebec as opposed to considering all bids from around the country. So, there may be some modest gains to be made there. They're not necessarily going to be increasing the GDP of Canada. And I think in some of the more contentious areas, as we flagged out in our report around BC, where we're dealing with the consequences of open net fish farms and the sort of sea lice and other contaminants that are affecting wild salmon stocks. So it's an area of shared jurisdiction. And to the extent that the federal government and the BC government are both sort of withdrawing some of the policy space that they have to address the issues under current arrangements, it potentially puts handcuffs on our ability to act in the public interest going forward. But again, a lot of this is like potential policy space, and it's only if someone were to challenge it under trade rules. It's not really clear that there's a whole lot to be gained from all of this, certainly not hundreds of billions of dollars worth of gains.
What about moving professionals around? Nova Scotia announced that it was going to be far more receptive to letting people in, I think including medical specialists from other provinces. And then the professional bodies in that province were quickly on their hind legs saying that this would be extremely dangerous. Is that an area where we could get more efficiency? It seems strange that an engineer, for example, would have to wait to register in a province when they qualified somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any issues like that for engineers or for doctors or nurses. The vast majority of Canadians can move, fairly freely. I think the concerns was that in a very limited number of occupations, that there may be some additional time requirement of being in that province, or you may need to be recertified or take some extra exams. So the tendency has been to shift to more of what they call a mutual recognition approach, where you just accept that person first, and then you do the upgrading and testing after the fact. But mostly we're talking not about doctors and nurses. We're talking about like dental hygienists and like licensed practical nurses, which are sort of a step between orderlies and registered nurses. So again, to the extent that there are agreements we can have to harmonize these standards upwards and facilitate some areas where there are problems, we should go ahead and do that. But for the most part, this is putting the cart before the horse.